In this video, I'm going to be looking at the foreword to Theurgy and the Soul, the Neoplatonism of Iamblichus by Gregory Shaw, which has proved a rich and evocative study. And what I'm attempting to do is basically to summarize, right? And to try and understand what the heck is being talked about here. And I guess the principle is that by talking about the ideas that I feel are relevant and interesting, I can better understand them and um, reinforce them within my own memory and knowledge. The foreword was quite dense, and it looks at a sort of comparison between Neoplatonic theurgy and Christian incarnation. To begin, I'm going to jump to a definition of theurgy from the preface. Theurgy is divine activity communally shared. So the first idea is that the philosophy of the ancient Greeks is, in a sense, religious. And by that, I mean that the Greeks were not merely concerned with philosophizing in the modern sense, but rather, quote, with the cultivation of spiritual practices that would realize the communion of the soul with the gods. And so the idea in connection with Christianity is that the Christian liturgy inherited significantly from, quote, cultic practices within Greek philosophy. And so theurgy is, in a sense, used as a term by Iamblichus, who, this is going to involve a fair bit of editing. Yeah, so Iamblichus he lived between 245 to 325 AD, and he was a Syrian Arab Neoplatonist philosopher who determined the later direction taken by Neoplatonism. He was a biographer of Pythagoras. He was a student of Porphyry, who studied under Plotinus. And he's really pushing the doctrines and also the practices of theurgy, which he understands as like the performance of certain rites and rituals, through the practice of which the goal of philosophy could be accomplished, namely union with the divine. A lot of this is direct quotation. And so these rites, like Iamblichus is essentially an apologist for Plato, and he's also an apologist for theurgic practice. So he's sort of observing, and he is like the founder of a school, right? A Neoplatonic school. And he's sort of observing many cultic and ritual practices that were extant in his time and providing a rational and philosophical justification for them in terms of the Platonism and Neoplatonism, as in some combination of the work of Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus. And so these theurgic rites, these practices, they're equivalent to, they're sacramental. What do we mean by that? We mean that matter is employed or used within these rites to achieve union with the divine. And I will come back to the term that's being used for matter, hyle. And I'm again probably going to mispronounce virtually everything. But I'm not from ancient Greece, so I think deserve to be forgiven for that. And I will quote him here. We get a quote on page 6 of the foreword. Quote, "Since it was necessary that earthly things not be deprived of participation in the divine, The earth received a certain divine portion, capable of receiving the gods. The theurgic art, therefore, recognizing this principle in general, and having discovered the proper receptacles in particular, as being appropriate to each one of the gods, often brings together stones, herbs, animals, aromatics, and other sacred, perfect, and deiform objects of a similar kind. Then, from all these, it produces a perfect and pure receptacle. Okay, so the idea here is that the theurgist is a kind of ritual practitioner, somewhat akin in some ways to a shaman. And this practitioner gathers different phenomena on a particular occasion. So imagine that there's a rite or a ritual devoted to the god Apollo. Well, they would bring appropriate objects, play particular songs, particular animals or smells would be involved. Um, and that constellation of phenomena constitutes a symbol, literally, in the sense that the etymology of the word symbol literally means to gather together or bring together. So this matter, which is gathered into a symbol, allows the theurgist to practice in such a way that that symbol affords the opportunity for participation in the divine. It's a way of invoking a particular god. And what's important about this point is that it's a positive view of matter. So, hyle, literally hyle, is a technical term for matter coined by Aristotle. And what to say about that term? I don't think I need to say too much about it at the moment, just to say that it's a term for matter, which in the course of these rituals and rites, matter is made a receptacle or a vessel of divine energy. Again, I have to ask for sort of some philosophical and poetic license until I can try to address questions like, what the heck do you mean by divine energy, Sam? Well, I'm quoting directly from the text, so we're going to be going slowly. Yeah, so importantly, this was proposed by Iamblichus as a kind of recovery of Plato's cosmic vision as articulated in the Timaeus, which Iamblichus stood was being threatened by the dualistic and Gnostic impulses of Plotinus and, quote, Platonian Neoplatonism. So the idea here is that the highest good is not realized by escaping from materiality, but instead by embracing matter and by embracing multiplicity in a demiurgic way. Okay, what do we mean by demiurgic? I'm about to get to that. Yeah, in the meantime, just to say that what's important here is that Iamblichus is giving sort of practical, like he's giving a practical way, like a method or a procedure, like through ritual practice, right? Namely theurgic practice, a way of realizing Plato's doctrine of amnesis. So we're talking about the reawakening of the soul through contact with the sensible or material world. So this is a sort of philosophical position which states that we have souls or we are had by souls, like the ego is a sort of appendage of the soul in some way, but we're incarnated in this world in such a way that our soul is in some way asleep, and that part of the soul's union with God, or like the whole point of philosophy is in a sense to wake up again. This is the myth of Plato's cave, right? That we can leave the cave through anagogic ascent and go up and through self-transcendence, wake up to the really real. And theurgy is a particular way of understanding how to do that, namely through contact with the sensible material world. So in a way, it's a ritualistic elaboration of the cosmology of the Timaeus, such that philosophy, quote, finds its apex not in disembodied reason, but in cultic participation in the divine works. So continuing, what this implies is not only this kind of heritage that underlies the Christian liturgy and its emphasis on rites, for example, the Eucharist, eh, literally like eating the body and blood of Christ is very we'll talk about, way to contact the divine through matter. It's the same idea, right? But the point here is also that there's a focus on incarnation, meaning that our incarnate being, our being in this life, our being here in these bodies with these identities in these lives, is a vehicle of salvation through theurgy. So what this means is that like being incarnate, being in these bodies is not a kind of trap. It's a vehicle toward our salvation, so to say, where that salvation is rooted in a very careful and precise understanding of embodiment. What does it mean to be embodied, and how can we be embodied in such a way as to facilitate access to self-transcendence, access to the gods, or what was understood as gods in that time. And for Plato, importantly, as articulated in the Timaeus, the individual soul is called to imitate the activity of the demiurge. The obvious question for non-Platonists is, what the heck is meant by the demiurge? So the answer is that in Plato's Timaeus, the demiurge is a craftsman or artisan, a benevolent, rational, and divine figure responsible for shaping and ordering the physical universe. It's an ordering principle that brings structure out of pre-existing chaos. Creator of the lesser gods, creator of the world soul, structures the limitations and necessities of the physical world. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the idea is that by imitating the activity of that demiurge, the soul ascends in some way. So that kind of imitation, so to say, is at the heart of theurgic rites. There are several obvious questions that come out of that point, which is that like how does that imitation work exactly? Like how are we supposed to understand that imitation? Or like how are we to get a sense of this demiurge, and how can we be sure that the imitations that we enact are truthful or like accurate in some sense? But more importantly, there's some point here that for Iamblichus, in contrast to Plotinus, the soul is fully descended and fully incarnate in these bodies, in this world, which is different than Plotinus, who doesn't think that the soul is fully descended. So they differ on that point, and like important questions like how are we to determine whether the soul is fully descended into this life? You could ask, what is the purpose of accessing the divine? Like to what end? Is that a normative standard that we ought to apply to ourselves? Importantly, I asked the question, do divinity, agency, and awareness go together? is it the case that by more fully embodying divinity in these lives that we become more aware? Because that seems an important consideration, because if we don't necessarily become more aware, then it may not necessarily help. And then there's the obvious question about agency, as in, do we become more competent? Do we become more capable in this way? That in some ways being understood as a good thing. But then there is one final question of like, what binds these qualities to the good? There are divinities which I might understand to be not so friendly, where theurgic practice may not be toward the good. But what I would understand here essentially is that theurgy, as a set of rites and rituals, is an effective form of sacrament, where sacrament is understood as taking matter as a kind of offering, literally as a sacrament, that in such a way that there is measurable participation in divinity itself. And as a little aside, obviously, psychedelics are going to be the most reliable and potent way that we or anyone else knows to elicit measurable participation in divinity in the form of mystical experience, now being measurable with the MEQ 30 questionnaire coming out of Johns Hopkins. My point is, there's a claim being made, which is about the efficacy of theurgic practice in terms of participation in divinity, participation in the sacred or sacredness. And we don't have to sort of just take people's word for it. We can actually, to some degree, empirically verify such claims. So I'm going to continue on here, trying to do the whole foreword in this one video. This sort of dovetails with Christianity in the sense that the ascent of the soul is rooted in the incarnate descent of God. So there's a way that when God has descended into the body of Christ, literally like God incarnate in a being, this in some way allows the ascent of the soul, which is a bit of a paradox. The contribution of Iamblichus would be to get us to understand, yes, but this requires active enactment. It's not simply that the soul receives grace in order to connect with God in that way, but that through practice, right, through ritual, through rites, that we actively enact participation in the divine, that being understood as a proper form and indeed culmination of philosophy itself. Yeah, so this is grounded in the doctrine of participation. So this is obviously reminding me of Vervaeke's participatory knowing. So the idea is that by participating in matter in the right way, that the soul is allowed to participate in the divine, or that, yeah, through the right practice, sacramental practice, the divine can be allowed to be present. So from here, it gets quite tricky from page 8 of the preface, because like they start talking at a very high level about the sort of overlap between how to access the one, as in the Platonic one or Neoplatonic one, and how that is like different or the same as the Christian God. There are many paradoxes which are worth naming. One of them is that the one is, quote, imparticipable. I'm not even sure how to say the word, not able to be participated in. Uh, there's a way that it's absolutely beyond in a certain way or inaccessible. And that's a paradox because the philosophy that we were just talking about was the philosophy of radical participation. And the idea is that somehow both of those qualities are sort of existing at the same time. I won't go on about it. I'll simply keep going. One of the ideas that I've singled out is that the one, which is in some ways behind and preceding the Platonic demiurge, if I understand correctly, is the one is supremely intimate with everything because nothing exists except by virtue of some sort of unity. And the in some ways, I'm understanding that the anagogic ascent and descent, like the cyclical process of the soul through theurgy, is partly involves this deep self-emptying or kenosis, such that one can like what I'm saying is that there's a way that the divine or the one is itself self-emptying. There's a radical, quote, sharing out of the divine life. So there's a way that everything emanates from or emerges from the one, and that when the soul can self-empty, when the soul, you could say, enacts kenosis, it is in that way imitating. So when I said the one is supremely intimate with everything because nothing exists except by virtue of some sort of unity, um, there's a way that sort of at every level of being, this radical emptying, like emptiness understood as an activity, as an action, as a process, emptying is present at every level. Like what I'm saying is that that quality, let's call it a quality, is present at every level of being. So there's something that changes in a sense as the soul anagogically ascends and self transcends. But there's something that remains the same, and that something that remains the same is, in a sense, the quality of emptying. Well, that's one way to approach it. See what I mean? Like difficult. Yeah, so just in passing on this quality that I called like not able to be participated in or inaccessible, there's a kind of paradox there that I've been attempting to name, that there's this tension between the fact that the one cannot be fully participated in because it's, in a sense, radically beyond or inaccessible, but also this philosophy of theurgy is in some ways grounded in a foundation of radical participation, that we can actually participate more fully in the one. So one of the sort of guiding questions is like, how do these guys like Iamblichus, Proclus, Porphyry, Plotinus, and so on, how do they deal with this paradox and other paradoxes that will probably get named? And one of the ways they do that is by putting together these different qualities that go together. So they come up with a couple of different triads, which I'm just going to name in passing. For example, there's a claim that sort of every level of the scale of being includes a combination of remaining, outgoing, and reversion or reverting. And that triad, remaining, outgoing, and reverting, can also be constituted as imparticipable, participated, and participating. So that which is beyond participation, that which is participated in, and that which is participating. I won't go into that anymore. I'm just naming that in passing as some of the stuff that gets drawn out here. The rest of the book, thankfully, isn't quite so academic, for want of a better word. Yeah, so they put it differently, much better than I did. So the idea is that there is something which is communicated down the levels of being through this kind of ritual practice or theurgy. The idea is that what is communicated down the series is that which cannot be communicated. So there's a way that that which is self-hiding or again inaccessible beyond participation, it always takes the lead. So that quality kind of recurs at every level. So there's a claim that something which is communicated to the theurgist in their practice is communicated in a way which is impossible or ineffable. There is an ineffability which is made present. And the idea is that this is a particular paradoxical model, which is called methexis, literally Methexis, methexis, which is apparently characteristic of theurgic Neoplatonism, which is basically the idea of participation all the way up, despite this fact of the aspect of being which leads, which is its inaccessibility. The idea is that this model of participation was adopted and Christianized, and it came to express a foundational Christian truth, quote, "Whoever finds his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." That's Matthew 10:38. And then there's a couple more quotes, which I will include. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. John 12:24. This is my body, which is given for you. Luke 22:19. Okay, so these are all ways of expressing that in some way you have to lose something to find something, roughly speaking. There's also a claim that there's a kind of law of existence from a Christian point of view that being itself is rooted in a dynamic of radical love, that being itself is a kind of gift. So this is connected with this quality of self-emptying or giving oneself. There's an idea that one cannot fully find oneself except through a sincere gift of oneself, which is like essentially variations on the theme, give and you will receive. But it's not just give, it's like literally give yourself away, offer yourself up into participation in the divine, and then you will receive that very same participation. So all of this is sort of preamble or literally preface to come to the conclusion that Christianity came to be committed to these ideas of both gift, like self-giving in the sense of self-emptying, self-offering, gift, and paradox. Paradox, the quality of paradox as fundamental dimensions of its theology. Again, these two qualities, gift and paradox, are understood to be fundamental dimensions of Christian theology, drawn from out of this Platonic and Neoplatonic heritage. So the authors spend a little bit of time here poking at Augustine So Augustine, as I understand, in sort of the 5th century, so a little bit later, came to like firmly oppose the magical demon invoking character of pagan theurgics. So there's a way that Augustine, who's sort of like one of the principal architects of the early church, was like really against this stuff. And they're sort of pushing back. The authors are sort of pushing back on that and saying, uh, like, yeah, Augustine gave these sort of massive critiques of magic and of pagan practice, and the doctrines of Pythagoras at like elements of Platonism that were present around the time of Augustine. But they're sort of saying that Augustine's idea of the city of God, the title of one of his books, I think, was it's not only an eternal reality, it's not only an eschatological reality, but it's also a quote temporary or temporal reality. And what that implies, again, we're sort of cruising through. Augustine's a pretty heavy hitter, like wrote a lot and it was undoubtedly quite complex and so on. The idea is that the city of God is not the mere aggregate of the truly saved individuals, but it's actually a literal earthly polity. So literally like a group or groups of people that combine theory and practice in specific ways that facilitate the ascent of souls to be saved. So there's what they're saying is that there's a way that Augustine can be understood in light of this tradition also. The idea being that this kind of strand of the Christian heritage got worked into the church tradition, right? And the practices that are a part of it. So we're almost through this, but we're going to get to, again, one of the more challenging sections. So I'm going to like quote the lines that I've underlined and then try to understand what they mean. There's a quote, the basic metaphysical convertibility between Christianity and theurgic Neoplatonism lies in the way the paradox of participation entails for both a non-contrastive and non-dualist construal of the relation of divinity and even hyle, the lowest form of creation. Matter and images can therefore truly communicate the transcendent. The world is therefore truly sacramental. Okay, so the important part there, I think, would be the final part, which is that what the authors are pointing to is this kind of common foundation beneath both Christianity and Neoplatonism, and it has to do with this idea that matter and images can truly communicate the transcendent. The world, quote, is truly sacramental. So it's a kind of non-dual vision of the relation between the divine and matter, such that matter can communicate that which is transcendent. And for Christianity, that is the basis of the Incarnation, which is that matter itself, in the form of the body of Christ, uh, matter and indeed our matter, as in the body of the church, uh, becomes by participation in Christ's mystery, the medium through which salvation is accomplished. I'll simply leave that there. So we get a relevant quote here, which I have chosen to include. So John of Damascus in the 8th century um, gave a defense of the Christian veneration of the icon. Icon, literally like iconography, like cloth, metal, ivory, wood, manuscript illustrations, frescoes, mosaic statues, and so on that show God in the form of Christ. Let's say so. John of Damascus is trying to defend such iconography, and he says, I do not venerate matter, or hyle. I venerate the fashioner of matter, who became matter for my sake, and accepted to dwell in matter, and through matter worked my salvation. And I will not cease from reverencing matter, through which my salvation was worked. For if the body of God has become God unchangeably through the hypostatic union, what gives anointing remains, and what was by nature flesh, animated with a rational and intellectual soul, is formed. It is not uncreated. Therefore I reverence the rest of matter and hold in respect that through which my salvation came, because it is filled with divine energy and grace. Okay, so that's to say that for this John of Damascus, for him, matter itself has been transformed by the Incarnation. So that the divine has descended in some ways to the lowest order of creation, and this draws the soul of the lost human being back toward God. So there's a clear trace of Iamblichus here in the sense of in this Christian theology, which is that to John of Damascus, matter itself is pregnant with power to communicate that which is radically beyond matter. What this implies, what this means is that matter is capable through images and through image making, through symbols, I would say, of being a true icon of the divine. So for this John of Damascus, as for Iamblichus, the conviction of the worthiness of matter to image the divine origin means that matter itself is receptive of the divine, and it can therefore be a vehicle of the communication of divine energy. So, quote, through rites and prayers, the divine power of matter to be receptive to the divine energy is unlocked, making it, matter, thereby a vehicle of the goal of the soul's receptivity to divine energy. So the soul, through matter, can access the divine. Quote, in this way, the logic of Neoplatonic theurgy involves a kenosis of mind, a self-emptying of mind, in such a way that we, essentially when we get out of our minds, literally offering ourselves to, you could say ritual practice, or you could say to the divine, that this process deeply involves participation in matter. So there's a kind of return downwards. This self-emptying and self-giving, self-offering is connected with the simplicity and non-reflexivity of material being. So there's a way of when we get rid of everything that's abstract and everything that's complicated and return to that which is simple, we also return to matter. We return to the material images, symbols, and rites and practices that facilitate, through self-emptying, participation in that which is most high. Quote, for John of Damascus, the most profound theurgical amnesis, or remembering, involves recapturing what Iamblichus calls the pure and divine form of matter. Quote, using matter, one may be lifted up to the immaterial archetypes. Yeah, the difference being that for Iamblichus, this sort of pure divine form is actually beyond form and matter, whereas for these Christians, it's that pure divine form is Jesus Christ himself. So the common thread here, as I'm about to finish, is that Christianity and theurgic Neoplatonism, they each describe and discern a common paradox at the heart of being. There's a co-belonging of these ideas of descent all the way down, that the divine descends all the way down into matter, and participation all the way up, that through ritual practice, through iconography, through specific rites, one can participate in that which is most high. For in the case of Iamblichus, one sees above all the idea that while prayer is not about changing the minds of the gods, neither is it just self-therapy. Instead, prayer is the theoretical and practical endeavor to arrive at a kind of attunement with the divine that will truly allow the divine influence to flow into reality. So on this our finite level, there is a genuine synergy between that which is divine and our own humanity. And that's all from the preface. But to finish this, I'm going to give the final paragraph to give some sense of the flavor of this kind of writing. What has this been? It's actually been the foreword, not the preface. So anyway, I'll finish with this last paragraph from John Milbank and Aaron Ritchie's, who wrote the foreword. Quote, "The drive towards monotheism in Iamblichus' writings lies here, and not in a tendency to posit a one beyond the one, as a counter-movement to the general efflorescence of divine beings that was part of his deliberate defense of pagan polytheism. Indeed, as with Iamblichus's later successor, Damascus of Athens, the positing of ever yet greater absolutes was not an attempt to define an area absolutely reserved from all communication, but rather an attempt to indicate an ineffable that could comprise both the one and the many, both absolute reserve and generous outflowing. Certainly, in one respect, this all-encompassing one is thereby all the more replete and withheld, yet only to the degree that no act of self-donation lies outside its sway. No doubt, the arising aporie here, how to avoid both pantheism and acosmism, anticipates on one level the Trinitarian elaboration of classical Christian orthodoxy, which is a resolution through a heightened intensity of paradox, fully articulating the idea that God is in himself an ecstasy beyond himself, which includes an ecstatic reach towards the external beyond of creation. All the same, pagan theurgic philosophy increasingly approached the question of participation in terms of paradox and mediation, which accomplished a remarkable synthesis of common religious piety open to all, and not merely the philosophical initiate. Not merely the philosophically initiate. Achieving this synthesis, as Shaw shows to brilliant effect in Theurgy and the Soul, was the prestige of Iamblichus. That theurgic Neoplatonism aimed to do nothing other than return to the non-dualist essence of authentic Platonism through cultic ritual suggests that one current of Platonic thought was always running rather near to the ritual amnesis at the heart of the Christian Mass. And herein may lie the most lasting contribution of the Iamblican theurgical vision. Quote, "The Church, with its ecclesiastical embodiment of the divine hierarchy, its initiations, and its belief in salvation through sacramental acts, may have fulfilled the theurgical program of Iamblichus in a manner that was never concretely realized by Platonists. Well, that was a lot. And that will do from John Milbank and Aaron Ritchie's as the foreword to Theurgy and the Soul, the Neoplatonism of Iamblichus by Gregory Shaw, originally published in 1995 and republished in the second edition 2014. And I'll come back to the preface and then the rest of this arcane wizardry soon.